Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Kate, and thank you all for being here and those out there watching this on screen. It's really, from my point of view, historical times we are going through. I had a very emotional day last Tuesday, 17th of May, 2022, in Oslo. It was the first celebration of 17th of May, our Constitution Day, since the pandemic. And I was walking there in Oslo with the children's parade and looking at those 6 years old and thinking, last time we celebrated in this way was 3 years ago, and they were only 3 years old. So probably they have never experienced the crowd and the cheering that we all experienced last Tuesday. And it reminds us that freedom, democracy, and the right to speak and all the human rights we take for granted doesn't come for free. And I think that was something we all thought of when we were walking around in Oslo or elsewhere on our Constitution Day. It was also emotional for me because I received updates from Ukraine in the morning about our delivery of material to Ukraine. I also met the Finnish and Swedish ambassador on the 17th of May, and they were both so happy for Finland and Sweden applying for NATO, which is a huge step, political step, for both Sweden and Finland. But I think on the military side, the integration will go very smooth because we have worked so closely together for years. But just to see the ambassadors and talk with them about the future of NATO, with the Nordic countries included, was also something that touched me. And in the evening of the 17th of May, I saw on television a Ukrainian mother with her children celebrating our Constitution Day and talking about the future when she would return to Ukraine and once be able to celebrate their freedom again. And she was so happy to be here in Norway, but also longing to go back to her own country that was attacked by Russia. So it was a very special day, and it made me think for this conference that I should start by framing sort of what we are going to discuss later on, and also what me and Ben Hodges will discuss on the podium afterwards, because I know that Ben will talk more specifically about Ukraine. So why is this historical times, and how do we know we are living in historical times? I think for us, of my generation, we haven't really thought through how historical this is right now, because we are living in the midst of it. But I'm sure the 6-year-old parading through Oslo experienced something he or she will never forget. The first day of people being together. It's historical because, for the first, we have been living through a pandemic. And I never thought I would experience that, to be honest. Living through a pandemic. With 2 years of closed-down societies and a lot of focus on the health crisis that this was, but at the same time making sure that this health crisis did not develop into a security crisis. So our vision from the first day in March 2020 back in Norway was to keep our forces operational, continue to do our missions, continue to build to build our new recruits into soldiers. And all this we managed to do during a pandemic. We were able to keep our forces operational in Norway, in NATO, with partners. So across the Western society, forces were able to operate. We were able to solve our missions in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Africa, during a pandemic. And I think that's quite an achievement, and I think that's also something to remember, how we actually tackled these challenges. And then during this pandemic, we also had the extraction from Afghanistan. So after 20 years in Afghanistan, and I was there in January 2002 for my first time, after 20 years we were leaving. And we were leaving in quite a hurry. And we were leaving in quite a hurry during a pandemic. So the lessons learned from Afghanistan are, of course, many and numerous. But I think one of the big mistakes we did was that we took over the fight from the Afghans. I think that's what happened when Afghanistan and the Afghan forces so fast actually were dissolved and didn't put up the fight, because they were not used to fight alone. They were used to fight together with us. Very unlikely to what we see, a very unlike situation to what we see in Ukraine right now, where the Ukrainians are fighting with support, of course, moral support, weapon support, but they are fighting alone. They are taking the fight for their country. And that's something we actually didn't do in Afghanistan. We were fighting for the Afghans, and with the Afghans, but we didn't let the Afghans take the fight on their own soul, which I think was one of the big lessons learned from that 20-year period. But what was on the positive side was, of course, the unity of forces, the unity of allies, unity of partners, the 40 nations plus that were contributing in Afghanistan for 20 years. They stood together. I think that's also something we have to think about today when we see the unified support for Ukraine across NATO, with partners, across the globe. So on the conference, I was in Ramstein, where the US pulled together 40 nations to donate equipment and support to Ukraine. We had, of course, NATO nations, but we also had partner nations that were with us in Afghanistan. And we had nations like South Korea, Japan, New Zealand, Australia participating, because we share the same values, we share the same principles, and that's something that will also unify us in the future as well. So if you look at countries like Russia and China, of course, they are big countries. They are medium to global powers. They are definitely regional with aspirations to become global. And for China, that's about to happen. But at the same time, when you look at the values they share compared with the values of the 40 nations that were in Ramstein or stood together in Afghanistan, we are talking totally different systems. And the last thing, two things that makes these times historical is, of course, what we saw from October last year, with the buildup of forces around Ukraine, the sharing of intelligence to stop the invasion was historical in itself. And I thought about the risk involved in this. First of all, you have the risk of sharing intelligence in itself, because by sharing what you know, you also give an opponent or someone you are spying on the opportunity to find out what do you know, and thereby how do you know it. So it's a huge risk involved in sharing intelligence. That's sort of the professional risk. The other risk was, of course, that this sharing of intelligence was intended to stop the invasion of Ukraine. That was the overall idea about it. Share intelligence so you don't give Russia an excuse to invade Ukraine, either through a false flag operation, as we call it, or just by us being taken by surprise. So if that sharing had worked to the full extent that we hoped for, with diplomacy as the main effort and the sharing of intelligence as a supporting effort, if that actually had worked, then we wouldn't have had an invasion in Ukraine. And then, of course, all the criticism had been that we were sort of making the situation look worse than it was. So that was the other risk, and it's a big political risk involved in this, with this sharing of intelligence. And then it goes back to the war, and it broke out on the 24th of February, as we all know. We remember that Russia did a test of their nuclear weapons, basically, on the 19th of February. It shows that nuclear weapons are back on the stage again. And that's President Putin's big lie, because he always say that NATO is a threat to Russia. At the same time, he's moving all his forces, or most of his forces, away from NATO borders to fight in Ukraine, which means that he doesn't really believe that NATO is going to attack Russia, because he knows that the retaliation with nuclear weapons will be too much for the world to tackle. So he knows that nuclear weapons are working as a deterrence, which could give other nations ideas, which is very dangerous. And also, he knows that NATO is not a threat to Russia. So, and that's the last thing that makes this historical time so emotional for me, is that Sweden and Finland actually now have applied and are looking forward to join NATO. And what does that mean for Norway? It means a lot for Norway. It means so much that I'm not going to go into detail on each part of it, but for everyone who wonders what this means for Norway, it's just to take a look on the map. Take a look on the map of the Scandinavian peninsula. Take a look, if you can, on our old defense plans, which not included Finland and Sweden. Take a look on the map with the only way to go from the Scandinavian peninsula to Europe without crossing a bridge or using a ferry is through Russia. So it means a lot. And we have to go into detail in the future now to see what does this really implicate for our development, our forces, for the Nordic cooperation, for our defense plans, and how in the end this will make our alliance even stronger, and it will also deter anyone, I think, from doing anything towards the Nordic countries, because together we are strong, and together with NATO and Sweden and Finland, we are even stronger. So the Nordic Defense Cooperation was started in 2007, and with this NATO membership, it will just speed up the process. So we are doing a lot, but we can do even more, and it will make a big difference for Norway in the future. So with that, thank you all for being here. I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I give the floor back to Kate. Thank you.